Hello, Kathy here, and we're going to talk about the principles of atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is a set of techniques that will really enhance, or can really enhance if you choose to use them, the feeling of depth, the illusion of depth. And atmospheric perspective principles are especially important because you don't really need to use linear perspective in order to have these work very effectively. So, for example, in this beautiful Sumi painting by Tohaku, we can get a strong feeling that some of the pine trees that he's depicting here are much closer to us than others. And if you ask yourself why that is, and I have asked many classes of students, typically people say there's more detail, there's more value contrast, right? The trees that seem to be in front are also a little bit darker than that light background of most of the painting. And the edges are just a little sharper, right? The trees as they seem to recede into the distance, the edges get very fuzzy and soft. It almost feels as if there's maybe a bunch of mist moving among those trees, and that's exactly what atmospheric perspective does. Is it tries to portray the actual presence of some atmosphere between you and the objects that you are depicting, or between your viewer and the objects that you're showing them. One really important thing about atmospheric perspective is edge, right? The quality of edges is one of the things that is going to distinguish the things that are close to you, or at least the things that you're choosing to put into a focal plane, and the things that are farther away or more out of focus. So here you see in this Martha Alf drawing that the edges of the pears, the close pears here, are the crispest edges that you see in the picture. The edges of the table here, where you see the table or the counter, whatever they're on depicted, are much softer and give us the feeling that that might be a foot or two away. And then here the edges of things in the very far background, probably a window, it looks like, are so soft that we just get a quick impression of something being there. That quality of the changing edge is really only possible if you eliminate lines. And that's one reason why we're studying a value-oriented way of drawing as well as a linear way of drawing. Both ways are beautiful and powerful, and they can be combined. But remember that once you outline an edge, you have really shut down a lot of the possibilities for making it very soft, if you wish to use that aspect of atmospheric perspective. So this is the phenomenon that you see maybe if you're driving in the mountains, right? And the trees next to your car as you go by on the road, you can see every detail. But the next hillside looks a little dimmer. The farther hillside looks dimmer yet. And what's going on here, of course, is that the sky, or the farthest background that you can see, the other objects are approaching it in value, so that they're darker and typically higher contrast the closer they are to you, and dimmer and dimmer and dimmer as they get back to a light background. And you see the same thing happening in this simple drawing from the Iron Giant. This is a charcoal drawing, and the faces that are in front, of course, they're larger. That's linear perspective, right? Or at least some playful take on that. But they're darker, and the edges are a little bit crisper, right? So the Iron Giant himself is not quite so dark because he's quite a bit further away. The buildings in the background are very light, and their edges are dim because the background happens to be light in this composition. Here the background is a little bit darker, and of course the reason this dead branch stands out so much in this Ansel Adams photograph is that it is not only bright white, but also its edges are very crisp, and we see a lot more detail in it than we do in the watery landscape behind it. So it's that effect of contrast, right? The things in the front don't necessarily have to be either light or dark, But as in this Seurat painting, if their value range goes all the way from bright white to very, very dark, then they are going to normally, all other things being equal, appear to be closer. Whereas if the values of things in the background approach each other and there isn't much contrast, then that gives them an advantage in feeling farther away. And this drawing by Seurat, it's actually a study drawing. I'm going to go back to just show you that central figure there again. It was very likely reversed onto the canvas. This study drawing shows you that even in his drawing, Seurat tended to draw with areas of tone rather than with line, because that reproduced more effectively the kind of thing he wanted to do with paint. He was a pointillist painter. He liked to put his paint on in tiny little dots that would combine optically to give the flickering color that he wanted. And as you see here, he's using a very toothy paper that grabs the charcoal in little dots so that he gets a similar effect with his charcoal. Very little outline, maybe right around the nose. You might see a tiny bit of an outline, but really what he's showing us here is a light form against a dark value, a dark form against a light value. Here's a Bruegel painting, one of my favorite paintings in the world, and you see down there where my cursor is, Icarus, the guy who tried to fly with wings where the feathers were held on with wax. He flew too close to the sun and his wings melted. And there he is, alas, falling into the water. But everything else going on in the painting is just gorgeously rendered, as if poor Icarus weren't even drowning. The plowman in the front there, you see every little leaf and the weeds, every little furrow in his landscape there, very, very clearly depicted in bright value contrast. And you see the city and the icebergs or islands or whatever they are in the back melting into each other with much, much less value contrast. Gives you the feeling that there might be miles and miles of space going on here. When I was in art school, they taught me atmospheric perspective by showing me the Mona Lisa. And you can see that she is a fine example of atmospheric perspective. Leonardo painted her face in great value contrast relative to the landscape that you see on either side of it. And it feels like in those few inches that your eyes travel from side to side on this relatively small painting, it feels like miles happen between the face and the landscape. And the same thing is done all the time by wedding photographers who use the idea of a focal plane to really focus in on one layer of space that they're interested in. Here, obviously, it is about the tip of the bride's nose. We see her eyebrows and her a little net veil there in great detail. Even her hair, her jawline are out of focus. We have more sophisticated eyes than Leonardo's viewers did because we're used to looking at photographs, and so we are aware that you can focus on any plane of space, and we read that very easily. So here, this garden gnome in front, corresponding to, say, the Mona Lisa, if Leonardo had been painting him, he would probably have been the focus. And that's kind of an interesting thought experiment, isn't it? This one here, which is in the focal plane in the photograph, would probably have been a little more out of focus, and this guy here in the background would probably have been most out of focus at all. But we're quite used to seeing images which focus on a plane of space that isn't in the foreground, and you can do that in your drawings as well, and your paintings. For example, in this photograph here, the focal plane obviously is on that shorter of all the soldiers, I assume, in a line here. And I'd like you to just ask yourself for a moment how that affects the way you see this photograph. How does it affect the story you tell yourself? How does it affect where your eyes go? How does it affect you emotionally, what kind of connection do you feel to that soldier as opposed to the one just behind him or the one way in the front on our right, right? Focus is a really important device for artists to begin to control, whether they are photographers or whether they draw and paint. So just in summary, atmospheric perspective is a set of techniques that will allow you to create a feeling of space by manipulating value contrast, detail, the amount of detail, and edge quality. So sharper edges, more detail, and higher value contrast are going to typically make that plane of space feel that it's closer to the viewer. Although if you're tricky, you can get that a focal plane to happen in an area that isn't even in front, as happens in this photograph. So I hope that you will enjoy using these techniques to deepen the illusion of space in your drawings and paintings.